I am greatly honoured to have been asked to put together a few words for the 2020 annual Remembrance at the Thomas Kent Memorial Park here in Rostellan, County Cork. This year we find ourselves in most unusual circumstances, and the strictures of lockdown prevent my delivering them as part of a normal public programme. But these strange times require us to find new ways of doing things. And so in order to appropriately mark the event, I hope this socially distanced video will serve to both remember the day and in its own way act as a record of the times we're living in. But every cloud has a silver lining, and for these lockdown remarks, I wanted to take the opportunity to have a more detailed look at the momentous events of 100 years ago than might have been possible if we were all there in person. Doing so serves as a reminder of how important a year 1920 was, not only in the history of Ireland, but in the history of our part of East Cork. I've said that 2020 finds us in unusual times, but in 1920, the people of this area were living through a period of extraordinary change. They had recently emerged from a pandemic of their own, in the shape of the virus commonly referred to as the Spanish flu. And they'd also suffered through a global war that had left a deep and lasting physical and emotional imprint on this area. On the heels of these events came the War of Independence, and as with so much that had gone before, East Cork had a front row seat. Our current pandemic has denied us the opportunity to fully remember and discuss 1920 in East Cork through the types of events that have become the norm during the decade of centenaries. So I wanted to take this opportunity to do so now, from the perspective of Cork Harbour's eastern shore. From start to finish, 1920 was a pivotal one on the road to Irish independence. In East Cork, the year began, literally, with a bang. In January, local IRA volunteers successfully assaulted the RIC Barracks in Carrigtwohill, the first occasion on which a semi-fortified police station was taken by the IRA. This was one of a series of coordinated strikes in the first days of January that in the eyes of many brought the conflict into the realm of full-scale war. It was certainly a harbinger for the many long, violent months ahead. 1920 would also be the year that brought the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and the British military to the highways and byways of East Cork. The IRA strategy in those first months of 1920 was centred on driving the RIC from the countryside, and it was something that local volunteers played a full role in. By then the local company of Aghada volunteers, which had been founded in 1917, had been designated as Company L of the 4th Battalion, Cork No. 1 Brigade, Irish Republican Army. In May of 1920, they were called upon to play their part in the battalion attack on the RIC Barracks Incline. This was a highly coordinated action in which each of the volunteer companies were assigned specific tasks. The job of the Aghada volunteers was to prevent forces from the Coast Guard station at Roach's Point and Fort Carlisle from coming to the relief of the Clyne Barracks once the attack commenced. To that end, around 15 local volunteers set out for Whitewell, just a few hundred metres from the park, with orders to block the road. They did so by felling trees and pushing boulders into the thoroughfare, preventing any swift response from Carlisle. Fortunately, no such attempt was made to relieve Clyne once the assault was made and the operation proved a success. Throughout the months that followed, a series of actions and attacks of various size and scale took place in East Cork. In June, the Cameron Highlanders came to Middleton, and it wasn't long before volunteers welcomed them to the area by surprising one of their patrols and stripping them of their arms while pretending to play a game of road bowls. Closer to home, there was also activity in Rostellan. On the 16th of August, the District Inspector of Middleton was forced to flee in his trap when half a dozen men fired shots towards him from a local field, apparently with the intent of intimidating him out of the area. Such small-scale incidents were becoming more and more common throughout 1920. Another local example came a few weeks later when the SS Queenstown, making her way from Aghada pier to Cove, was held up by 15 armed men in 3 rowing boats, with the result that 27 packages of military stores were captured. But August of 1920 saw another major event that is especially appropriate to mention given the date chosen for this year's Remembrance in Rostellan. August was the month that saw the arrest of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSwiney, on charges of sedition. Terence had succeeded murdered Tomás McCurtain to the mayoralty of the city and was now being targeted himself. Born into a Kilmurray family in 1879, he had a long history of Irish nationalism. He was a member of the Gaelic League and a leading organiser of the Irish Volunteers in Cork, and as such had played a major role in events in the county during the 1916 Rising. He was among those who had been interned at Frangach, and on his return was consistently arrested in the years that followed. Following his 1920 arrest and the 2-year sentence that came afterwards, Terence determined to go on hunger strike, declaring, "I shall be free, alive or dead, within the month." His protest quickly became major international news and garnered front-page headlines throughout the world. Terence McSweeney survived on hunger strike for an incredible 74 days. His loss was incalculable for his family, but his stand was also a propaganda disaster for Britain, as it garnered many new supporters for the cause of Irish independence. Terence McSweeney died on the 25th of October 1920, 100 years to the day of this Remembrance event, which is dedicated in his memory. He was far from alone that year in adopting the tactic of hunger strike, as a wave of arrests swept the island. In Cork alone, Michael Fitzgerald had died 8 days before McSweeney, while Joseph Murphy succumbed on the very same day as the Lord Mayor. But the selection of today's date for the Remembrance event is doubly significant, as October was also a highly notable month in the history of the War of Independence in East Cork. It was also 100 years ago this month that the 4th Battalion Active Service Unit, the Flying Column, came into being. The ever-increasing British pressure applied on volunteers during the course of the year had prompted the development of these special volunteer units, which are composed largely of men already on the run or in danger of arrest. From here on in, they would be the IRA's main strike force. Perhaps the most notable of the local volunteers to report to the 1st Column training camp in Knockgraha was Paddy Higgins, who had also been the first captain of the Aghada Volunteers in 1917. Paddy and his comrades in the unit faced particular challenges in the months ahead, as they sought to operate successfully in a region that was comprised of relatively open terrain that had a strong military presence and had good roads. But they were determined to do so, and the stage was now set for an even greater escalation of the conflict. Bodies like the 4th Battalion's Active Service Unit could not act in isolation. They relied on a local network of volunteers and supporters to assist them in conducting the war. At the heart of that system were safe houses, which played a crucial role in facilitating the movement of men and material around the country. 2 of the most important East Cork safe houses active in 1920 were in this locality. One was the Higgins farm, the home of Paddy Higgins and his parents. During the course of the year, it was used to aid men on the run, as a depot for supplies, and as a location to hold prisoners. Another was the home of Ellen Walsh, a grocer in Upper Aghada and a key member of the local Cumann na mBan. The women of the Aghada branch of Cumann na mBan had a vital role to play in the prosecution of the conflict, and Ellen was the branch quartermaster and treasurer. Indeed, few could match her for her dedication, which was recognised after the war by men like Patrick O'Keefe, OC of the Aghada Company. A local volunteer would later remember how Her house was the meeting place for the volunteers of the district and was always at our disposal for council meetings. She regularly received messages from higher authorities and always arranged for the prompt delivery of those messages to the local officers. This time 100 years ago, Ellen's home in Upper Aghada was one of the most important IRA locations in this part of the county, and as a result, it was regularly the target of suspicion from the Black and Tans. It was certainly a hive of activity. Through the years, she and her Cumann na Mban comrades had been collecting for the prisoners in Cork jail, and it was her house in which those funds were stored. When runs were being done into the city for those prisoners, it was Ellen who provided food and comforts to give them. In what little spare time she had, she was busy making and supplying haversacks and first aid outfits for the volunteers. As she later stated, she did everything for the boys, day and night. Once the flying column was formed, Ellen's home was an automatic choice as part of their safe house network. Men from the active service unit would call on her for food and cigarettes, and it was used for the storage of arms and ammunition. It saw most of its activity in that regard in December 1920, when the column spent an extended period operating in this locality. Like those active elsewhere through the county, the 4th Battalion column were on the lookout for opportunities to ambush British patrols, and that was the purpose of their move into the Aghada Company's area of operations. Specifically, they hoped to set a trap for a patrol from Fort Carlisle, taking advantage of the curfew that was then in place. As part of their measures to enforce the curfew, the British regularly posted signs around the country with details of the restrictions. The IRA arranged for these to be consistently removed, hoping in so doing to draw out the soldiers from the fort. Having selected an ambush position between Aghada and Fort Carlisle, the column lay in wait for a number of days that December, often in freezing cold conditions, hoping to spring their trap. The patrol never came, but the column did have a lucky escape as they warmed up in a safe house Incline following a particularly cold day in position. As they readied themselves to go back out to their positions in the morning, they found that the building was being raided by the Camerons, and they had to shoot their way out in order to escape back towards Aghada. The 4th Battalion Flying Column left the Aghada Company area on Christmas Eve 1920 and moved in closer to Middleton. In the dying days of the year, they launched a successful ambush on Middleton Main Street, an event that prompted the first official British military reprisal of the War of Independence, when a number of buildings inside and outside the town were burnt out. This brought the curtain down on one of the most momentous and traumatic years in the country's modern history. 1921 would see the war continue and bring more than its share of tragedy to East Cork, most notably at Clonmult. But the foundations that had been laid in 1920 by the IRA here and elsewhere proved to be some of the most crucial steps on the road towards independence. At a national and international scale, they were laid by people like Terence MacSwiney, Michael Fitzgerald and Joseph Murphy. But they were also laid by the efforts of locals like Paddy Higgins and like Ellen Walsh.